Hi, everybody. Good to see you this evening. Thank you for making a little more time for us. Abby, Kitty, did you actually change the schedule so that you wouldn't have to go after? Is that true? Did you actually? Do I have that much power over the festival? I'm swollen with power. I could say anything. No, I'll be good. We'll be good. Because we do have a good topic. And I think it carries on from what we heard in that Gwen Ifill clip about how we see ourselves. It may actually be fortuitous that we flipped the order because we've heard about the more practical aspect of how we see ourselves. What we want to talk to Professor Turkle about is maybe the more personal aspect of how we interact with one another as it relates to the structure of our democracy. I will just introduce our guest, Sherry Turkle, by way of saying that she's the Abby Rockefeller Mosaic Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT. She's the founding director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self, and is the author of a number of books, including Reclaiming Conversation, and her latest book, The Empathy Diaries, a memoir. Professor Turkle, welcome. It's good to have you with us.
It's great to be here.
The reason that we're having this conversation is kind of started by something that President Biden said at an event where he said that empathy is the fuel of democracy.
Yes.
And a lot of your research has to do with the nature of how technology affects our human relationships, including our capacity for empathy.
Yes.
I think before we get into all this, could we just define that term as you see it? What is empathy?
Empathy is the capacity to put yourself in the place of another. And in my work, I expand that, or because it's so important to me, I try to flesh it out a little more and give it a little bit more of a rigorous definition, that it's not just putting yourself in the place of another, it's putting yourself in the problem of another. And it's not just putting yourself in the problem, it's then making a commitment to be there for that other person. And it's not a kind of kumbaya moment where you say, I know how you feel, but quite the contrary. It's a moment of radical not knowing, where you say, I don't know how you feel. I'm here to listen and really tell me. And the reason I like beginning with that moment of radical doubt as opposed to, yeah, I've been divorced, I know how you feel, is that it puts the emphasis on a capacity that we're losing, which is to be able to listen to another person, you have to have the capacity for solitude. And all of my research, before writing this book, which is a memoir, all of my research has been on the ways that technology has subtly undermined our capacity for solitude and our capacity really for empathy, which begins in solitude, which begins in that capacity to be content with yourself and not always looking to a device, to an incoming, to some feed to tell you who you are.
Can I just get a sense from everybody here? This is a little bit less of an interview and more of a conversation. I think my title in this one is moderator/conversant. So I gained a new job title tonight. But for those of you who are here, when you hear that statement, empathy is the fuel of democracy, right? When that sits in your brain and in your spirit for a minute, how does that strike you? Agree, disagree, not sure. Empathy is the fuel of democracy. Agree? Disagree? Not sure? Okay, appreciate your honesty. I would love, I don't know how much time we'll have to talk, but whether you agree or not, I'm interested, particularly if you agree, if you have places wherever your communities are or your spheres of influence are where you see that interaction between empathy and democracy, or maybe the gap between the two of them that stands out to you. I'm curious about that in terms of how we think this through, and we'll get to that in just a bit.
What professor, that was a slip, that was really a Freudian slip. What President Biden was trying to say is that—
He's rather professorial,
I just
though.
gave him a job hike. What he was trying— What he was trying to say is that if you can't listen to somebody else and put yourself, not like them, not like what they have to say, but respect who they are and what they have to say, you're not going to be interested in their views about who won the election. You're not going to be able to hear their opinions on what your community should be. So actually, that in the very practice of a personal matter, you're doing the political. And so he was trying to make this connection between you can't be a citizen, you have to practice being a citizen by practicing this personal quality. And I thought that was really an important connection that I think I thought it was a very significant connection for him to make.
Now, with your research,
Yeah.
I imagine that over the last few years, you've seen a lot of this shift in terms of the way that we interact with one another
Yeah.
because of this black mirror in our pocket all the time.
Right.
Do you think, and this is a highly reductive question, so feel free to expand out, but do you think on balance, the impact of this black mirror has been more positive, more negative, very mixed, kind of ambivalent in terms of our ability to show empathy? I think it's more mixed, but what do you see?
It's very mixed, but one thing's for sure. The research shows that if we're having lunch and I take this and I put it face down and turn it off, you have it on, but if I have it face down and turn it off on the table, it will decrease our empathic connection during lunch. And if I take this, again, face down, turned off, and put it like here on the floor, really in your peripheral vision, it will decrease your empathic connection with me in the course of our interaction. Now, why is that? Because it's off. It's not interrupting you. It's because its very presence reminds you of all the elsewheres that are contained in that phone. And so...
Can anybody relate to that? Is this ringing true?
And so...
It's almost like you're trying to be noble, like, I'm going to give you my undivided attention now
Right.
until it beeps. But you've got my attention for right now.
But I'm saying that if you disenable it, the incredible thing our mind does, that if you disenable it, I'm saying turn it off. Even knowing that it's disenabled reminds you of all the elsewheres that it represents. So that the first thing you need to do with your children, your mother, your lover, your brother, I mean, anyone, is to really put your phone out of sight so that it is out of mind. Because we need to, one of the things that empathy requires, that relationships require, is the feeling of full attention. So a lot of the fuss about how much screen time and how much, we each need is so off the point. What people really need a little bit of is that feeling that you have my undivided attention.
Is that maybe also part of what we're talking about as it relates to technology and empathy? And we'll get to American democracy
And
in
I
just a
will
second.
give you back your phone.
I'm sure. Hey, it belongs to NBC. They can buy me another one if she took it to Boston. I don't know what to tell you. Do you think that this has to do with the shift in social media, in newer technology? I think that, if we went back a few decades and said that technology creates distance with empathy, you might hear somebody say, but I feel so much more enlightened now that I've watched Roots. Or I feel so very different now that I've seen Schindler's List. Like different kinds of technology for storytelling feel like they maybe have lost that empathic quality as they've become more niche, as they've become more tailored and less collective.
Well, I think the story of empathy and technology is very complex because I think that even now there are aspects of social media that increase empathy. There are ways in which we connect on social media communities that can increase our empathic connection. I'm talking about very specific practices with social media that can undermine empathy. That's why it's so important to study this in detail and not get confused by general principles about how much screen time our children should have, because it really isn't about screen time. It's about how you're using your technology and whether the way you're using it is specifically undermining your empathic capacity. It turns out that that certain uses of dividing attention, I would say using technology to divide attention in face-to-face interactions, where you're always looking elsewhere instead of at the person you're trying to interact with, is really the most corrosive.
I appreciate you starting with technology, because I feel like the way we use technology now shapes the democracy in dramatic ways, whether it's what we watch on television or what we share on social media. It's kind of inextricable in the conversation right now. With regard to that statement, empathy is the fuel of technology. We heard, I think...
Democracy.
I'm sorry, empathy is the fuel of democracy. It's definitely not the fuel of technology. If it was, this would be a whole different session. We got, I think, mostly agree, some disagree, quite a few who weren't quite sure. How do you see that statement? Empathy is the fuel of democracy.
I think it was a very powerful statement, because right now we're having so much difficulty. We're facing this chasm of almost disbelief in how we are going to talk to. We know that there are citizens in our country who, I mean, it was so eloquently put, live in a parallel universe. And so many of us don't know how we can even begin a conversation at Thanksgiving. And I think that beginning to conceive of empathic practice as not liking what you hear, but being able to listen to other points of view and just trying to imagine how people got to that point of view is a discipline that is worth developing. And I think in a democracy, it really is the beginning of respect, because I want to be respected. I mean, we have to come to a place where people who hate my opinion will let me vote and respect my vote. They're not going to stop hating my opinion. I just want them to respect my vote and let my vote be counted and not make it go away.
Well, then
I think growing up as a Jew, actually, and I write about this in my memoir. I grew up in a Jewish family where the shadow of the Holocaust was so heavy, and so many family members in Europe had been affected by it. And my grandparents, my grandparents raised me, and I was made to understand that people didn't have to like us. They had to allow us to live. And they had to obey the law and allow us to live. And that's why we were in America. That it didn't have to be what they felt in their deepest heart. It had to be their respect for us as human beings, obeying the law and allowing us to live our lives. And I think that that is really what we're trying to get back to here. Allow us to vote, respect people as human beings, understand where different people are coming from, and allow people to live according to the rules of this country. And I think that empathy for people as human beings with their individual stories is where that starts.
I want to poke at some of the edges of this, and I think part of what got me with the statement, empathy is the fuel of democracy, is that if empathy, I'll say this bluntly and then I'll elaborate. If empathy is the fuel of democracy, then black folks have never been in a democracy. Because we haven't gotten that kind of empathy from the society and yet have found ways to advance ourselves societally. I think that maybe mutuality is the fuel of democracy. Because you can be empathetic with someone that you never invite to your house and that you would not want to date your daughter. You can be empathetic with them from over there. But you don't have to like me to help pass a bill that's in my interest, right? You can say, this will get me reelected. And I know I'm being cynical about this, but we know how this democracy works. You can just say, this is a bill that'll get me reelected. It'll get me votes with the right constituencies. Maybe it's the sign of the times, the way the wind is blowing. This is what the kids are talking about on TikTok. Sure, I'll support this bill with no idea who I am. But you find a mutual interest. And so your need politically gets met, and my need as a human being gets met, and the wheels of democracy continue to turn. I feel like there are ways that it works in this country that don't require us to really care that much about one another to get things done, and yet we still get things done. Maybe that's a good thing, because then we're asking people to make an emotional leap that they're not ready to make, but we can make progress in the meantime. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense to me, and maybe that's why I brought the story back to my experience growing up in a Jewish household where I don't think my grandparents felt that the people who were tolerating them in the neighborhood liked them. I think that my definition of empathy includes a kind of respect for you as a human being that sort of encompasses what you just were talking about.
Yeah. I'd love to hear, we've got a few minutes left, and if there's a mic we can move around. If that statement, empathy is the fuel of democracy, if where you are in the sphere of influence that you're in, if that rings true, if you see that in your work, in your community, at work, in a way that might be illuminating for the rest of us, I'd love to hear from you, and we'll see if we can move a microphone around. You raised your hand yesterday. I recognize you. You asked a question yesterday. You can't be asking all the questions in my session, sir. That's not allowed. Okay, well, we will get you a microphone. If anybody else would like to speak before that gentleman, because he's going for the A+ in the class, and we can't have that happen.
Not at all, not at all. Just to level set and bring the audience back to the theme, how do you define democracy?
Is that Professor? How do you define democracy? Good question.
I think that just one. I think that President Biden. I mean, I'm trying to take this in the terms that he was using. I think he was really trying to get people to focus on these voting laws, of just really respecting that other people have a right to vote, and in your community there are going to be differences of opinion, and you can't get anything done unless you will respect that other people have a right to opinion. You don't have to like it. You have to see them as human beings in your community with opinions that you need to have. They have a right to exist, and they have a right to cast their vote and be respected. So I think that the reason I'm so glad you made that comment about sort of, look, let's bring this down to a less high level of what needs to happen, is that I think he was trying to define the lowest common denominator to live within a community where people will respect each other's being. And I think that's what and I think the internet can undermine that, because on the internet, there's so much abuse slung, and when you start to get called on it, you hang up.
But here's the crazy thing about that, and I'd love to hear from more of you if you'd like to keep moving the mic around. Let's get the mic to this gentleman right here, and then to you, ma'am. But while we're moving the microphone, I think, to your point about the internet, my experience, and this is the conversant part of my job, I guess, tonight, has been so different with social media as a person who works as a national broadcaster. I used to host a show on NPR before I started working for NBC, and when I was hosting 1A, we would constantly ask people for emails and tweets and Facebook posts and to share their stories. And even now that I have left NPR and joined NBC, the conversations I have with people are still lovely. They're wonderful. The American people are such wonderful people. I get treated with so much kindness and compassion and thoughtfulness, and people will write and tell me what they like about the show as well as what they don't like. They joke. They're very silly people. You're very silly people. But I have a lovely relationship with my audience. And I think, for me at least, it reinforces what I learned at NPR. And part of the reason I wanted to join NBC was to see if what we created on 1A could only exist in NPR space, or if there was something inherent to our democracy that would support it. I'm here to report to you today it's not about NPR. It's you. The American people will rise to whatever bar you set for them. I have never been disappointed by our audience, ever. Never. Although I do think that one piece of the comment from the president rings super true from the live events we used to do on 1A. We traveled the country all the time. I used to travel like once a month to different cities. And we used to do live events in all these different cities. And I would go out and speak to them and explain, we're gonna tape the show. If you have your cell phone on, please mute it, please turn it off. And before we started taping, I always said something to the audience to the effect of, I probably don't need to tell you this, but I'm going to say it anyway. And we're talking audience of like 400, 500, 600 people, 1,000 people. I probably don't need to tell you this, but I need to say it anyway. We really want to have the most robust conversation we can. And our job is to make sure the American people hear what you have to say. So please keep this event positive. If you hear something you agree with, you can clap. This is the library. If you hear something funny, of course you can laugh. But if you hear something you disagree with, your silence speaks volumes. It's much more powerful than booing. Because nothing plays worse on the radio than negativity. And if this show gets too negative, our audience will turn it off. And there will be nothing I can do to bring them back. And it will not be my fault. It will be your fault. My job is to make sure everyone here is treated with respect, and I'll do that. But you're driving. If you turn our audience away, they're gone. And this night is wasted. So please, no booing, no hissing, no heckling. That's my rule. Agreed? And for all the live shows we did, we never had a problem once. Every single show went well. The only complaint we got is they wanted us to serve refreshments after the shows because they wanted to stay and keep talking. Once they realized we gave them something rare that they couldn't get anywhere else, a safe, meaningful space to have a fun, smart conversation, they owned the mantle and they were like, he's right, this is on us. And they did it. Our audience batted 1,000. It was amazing.
You created an empathic space.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the point. In an empathic space, you're not allowed to heckle. You're not allowed to say, well, I don't want to hear that.
Oh, you're allowed, but it's on you. It's your job now. It's not my job. It's not my job to police your behavior. I have now told you what is at stake if you screw this up.
Yeah.
There's nothing I can do. You're all adults, be adults. And they were. And it was amazing.
Yeah.
It was absolutely amazing.
Well, in my opinion, what you created was a space in which people were called to be empathic with each other. And I think that's why you succeeded. Yeah. And I actually think during the pandemic, anthropologists call it a liminal time, a kind of time betwixt and between, when the old rules are broken and the new rules haven't emerged, where we've created a space where that kind of empathy is possible again, because there is this kind of betwixt and between moment that allows for a kind of empathy that's very special. I mean, several people have mentioned that we're in a moment that is a moment, and I think it's a moment that both allows for change, allows for personal change and social change, and for a very privileged kind of listening, very much like you created in the events that you talked about.
I know we've only got a few moments left here. I think we gave you the mic, so let's get to what you had to say before we're out of time.
Hi, so I think we all want to live in more empathic spaces. It's a beautiful phrase, in a more empathic world. My question is, thinking about empathy driving democracy in the way that President Biden intended it, particularly around voting rights, how do we square this desire for maximal empathy with constituencies that are actively working to undermine our democracy and take those rights away from people?
Well, we don't square. I mean, the point is that we live in a world where we need to acknowledge that not everybody is working for the same world. And I think it's much, the honest thing is to acknowledge that we're not living in a kumbaya moment. I thought that's what I liked about his. This was a Memorial Day speech, and he didn't use it as a moment to say we're all coming together. He used it as a moment to say, develop practices in your homes, in your private practices, that will allow you to be kind of warriors, because we are at war with those who would not respect the most basic things about other people. I think this is a moment to acknowledge a kind of war mentality. And the question for me is, as a citizen, what are the things that we have to do to make ourselves better citizens, to participate as citizens and teach our children to be better at being in this kind of war zone. And I think practices that make us better democratic citizens by giving us a repertoire of almost psychological strengths and capacities and fluidity in conversation and listening and tolerance for hearing things that are painful and difficult and understanding the difference between anger and revenge is good. But I don't think it's a moment where we should be hiding anything under the table. No.
And I think if I could just build on that, I think if empathy is your value, practice empathy. The beauty of the First Amendment is it's not designed to protect the speech you like. It's designed to protect everything else. That's the point of democracy. Democracy, I said this on my very first time on this stage at the festival, democracy is a contact sport and everyone gets bruises, even the winners. You're not supposed to go through this democracy unscathed. You're supposed to get in. You're supposed to get bruised. It's supposed to hurt, because the easy path is to smooth away dissent and disagreement and diversity, and we all just march to the same drum. That's what it looks like when democracy fails. A failed democracy feels easy. A healthy democracy hurts, because you either decide life has to be perfect or life gets to be more perfect. We can't have both. You gotta choose. So if you wanna live in empathy, you kind of have to accept that the bruises are gonna come. But the bruises make us a stronger country. They're a sign that you've done the work to make America stronger. I'd take the bruises. That's just me. One last question before we move on. Can I have my phone back? I feel extremely naked. I felt completely naked on the stage. Thank you. Thank you so much. The new book is called The Empathy Diaries, a memoir by Professor Sherry Turkle. Thank you, Professor. Much appreciated. Thanks, everybody.